Hi all, my name is Victoria Black and I am the Head of People and Payroll at the charity. I'm also an inclusion champion and member of our EDI group. In both my roles, supporting people in their well-being is at the forefront of everything that we do, especially in times of what feels like constant change like these. I am so happy to welcome you all to the conference today, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to the Think Accessibility session in partnership with Purple Tuesday, where we will hear from Mike Adams and Charlene Overend. Mike and Charlene will be giving us an overview on how to go about creating accessible and inclusive environments, both professionally and personally. I'm very excited to learn more, and I hope that you'll find it very valuable too. Thank you very much for watching and enjoy.
Hi, I'm Mike Adams, and I'm the creator and founder of Purple Tuesday. And sitting next to me is Charlene Overend, who is the Global Director for Partnerships at Purple Tuesday. We are absolutely delighted in being involved in such a great event. And what we want to do is we want to immerse you for the next 25 minutes, half an hour, to think about accessibility and why it is so important for you in your kind of professional role, but also in your kind of private world as well. And we hope that you can have many, many practical takeaways to leave this event and go in and act. Purple Tuesday's purpose is really about supporting organisations, supporting individuals in organisations to become accessible, whether that's with your customers, whether that's with your employees, or whether that's with your future employees. And what we try to do is provide disability leadership through services, training, consultancy, and provide that kind of framework in which organizations can achieve their own plans, their ambitions in this space. And we work alongside brands that you will know, such as Boots, Standard Charter, and Allwyn. And what we do is we are a trusted, I think, strategic partner around access and advise on enhancing people, policies, and places, what we call our 3 Ps. And just in terms of Purple Tuesday, it was established back in 2018, I think it was, to support businesses think about and make accessibility commitments to change the practice in their business to better support the relationship with disabled customers and their families. And what we've seen is that evolve very much as an umbrella for the relationship with employees and future employees as well. And I think that's really important. And I think back, Charlene, to when Purple Tuesday first started, and it actually was a visit by me. And when I go shopping, I am a wheelchair user, and my partner. And one day we went to a shopping centre, and it was in the run up to Christmas, actually. And I don't like Christmas shopping. I perhaps shouldn't say that, but that's the truth. So I try and do it all in one day. And we went into 28 shops that day. And in 23 out of the 28 shops, the frontline staff either ignored us altogether or only spoke to my non-disabled partner. And we kind of instantly recognized that this wasn't about direct discrimination. This was about not wanting to unintentionally offend by saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. So the way around that was to swerve the conversation altogether. And if we just think about that for a moment, if you're a business and you're swerving that conversation, then there's going to be no engagement with that organization and the disabled person and the customer. And if you think of it in terms of employment, and you're the hiring manager, then you're very unlikely to employ a disabled person. And I think what's been great as we've evolved Purple Tuesday is that more and more, this is also about a conversation between the disabled community and businesses focused on solutions. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to you all today because you are part of making solutions and thinking accessibility so your world and the world for people who touch you is much more accessible. And if you're watching this and you've got a pen and paper or a smartphone in front of you, then here is a date for your diary. And it be, broadly a month away. Purple Tuesday Global Celebration event this year is on the 4th of November. And we have 9 countries taking part with activities and events across the world. Last year, we had over, 35 million eyeballs watching and being involved in some ways, a lot through kind of social media, their organisation and what it means to them in terms of Purple Tuesday. And this is an opportunity for a bit of fun. Your staff might dress up with a purple garment, for example. All sorts of things you can do just to recognise the importance of disabled people and accessibility. So, and interestingly, I was talking at an event a couple of weeks ago, and 2 things are really starting to emerge, which drives all of this and that drives Purple Tuesday. And one is the increased importance on providing an experience. And at the heart of what Purple Tuesday is improving the experience of a disabled customer or disabled employee. So it's about the experience. And the other one is a recognition that this is about collaboration. And this is not about let's compete, let's do it on our own. There's 8,000 organisations last year involved in Purple Tuesday, making all those commitments. You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, but take the good bits and the accessibility commitments that are relevant to you and your organisation and just make them happen. So I will stop there and I'll hand over to Charlene with some stats and some facts.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mike. And I think it is really important to understand why accessibility is important and important to businesses as well as individuals. So we've got 2 statistics on this slide that we're going to focus in on. So did you know that 24% of the UK population is living with a disability? And that equates to 16.1 million people here in the UK. So nearly 1 in 4 of us have a disability. And that the disability community, and that is families who include someone with a disability, represents 33% of the world population. So really, this isn't a community that should be overlooked. Moving on, some more statistics to be aware of. Did you know that 17% of disabled people are born with their disabilities? So it's only 17%, and therefore 83% acquire their disability in their lifetime. And this is really important to highlight because We know as well that disability figures are increasing with age. So organizations really need to think about future-proofing themselves for the increased number of employees and customers that are going to have disabilities that will be engaging with them. And we also know that up to 80% of those living with a disability have a hidden disability. They are invisible. So you just wouldn't simply know by looking at somebody that they had an additional need or requirement because of a disability. So again, organizations need to start thinking and reorientating what their maybe previous thoughts were in terms of what we mean by disability in 2025. Another interesting fact that I did want to point out as well is that 8%, only 8% of people with disabilities are actually wheelchair users. Yet the international sign for disability is the wheelchair. So what we really need to think here is, when we think about accessibility in relation to disability, we have to think beyond ramps and lifts when we think about accessibility, especially when we look at the numbers around those hidden impairments that I previously spoke about. And the disability market, right, that's the spending power of the disability community, is £274 billion in the UK alone. And it equates to $13 trillion globally. So this really is not an insignificant group, an insignificant market to be ignored. And by simply making your organizations more accessible to that market, you actually then can gain access to that spending power. We know that only 10% of organizations currently have a dedicated strategy in place to access the disability market, to attract the disabled customer. So there is a huge opportunity for organizations to develop and to build their business plans by focusing in on accessibility. And I wanted to bring up two other statistics, which I think is extremely important. Whether you are an organization that is profit making or service delivery, it's really about looking at the satisfaction levels of your customer, client, visitor, service user, whatever it may be. Because we know that 75%, so 3 in 4 disabled customers and their families have walked away from an organization because of poor, inaccessibility or inaccessible experiences. And this is a huge potential loss to businesses across this country globally. So we really need to think about the experience, the quality of the experience we are giving the disabled customer. And it's not just about walking away physically from the space. We also know from a report called the Click Away Pound, and this is the money that is lost by businesses in the UK just because of inaccessible websites. And that is equating to like £17.1 billion a year is being lost simply because somebody with a disability has not been able to complete a transaction online because they haven't been able to access the information required in order to be able to do that. So again, huge opportunity here for organizations to improve their bottom line ultimately. And finally, I just wanted to point out the fact that we know that organizations that invest in disability inclusion and accessibility, they are likely to outperform their peers. Research has shown that disability inclusive leading organizations enjoy 1.6 times more revenue each year simply because they have invested in accessible and inclusive experiences. So it really is important for your organizations to put a priority here. So now I want to talk a little bit about, so what do we actually mean about accessibility? What is it really all about? At its core, it's about designing and creating environments, products, services, and information in a way that allows everyone, regardless of their abilities or disabilities, to access them. Fundamentally, accessibility is about inclusion, equity, and dignity. From an organizational perspective, accessibility needs to be considered and prioritized across the 3 purple pillars, which Mike mentioned earlier. your people pillar, your place pillar, and your policy and process. So I'm now going to go into each of those pillars in a little bit more detail. So as part of the people pillar, accessibility plays a vital role in fostering inclusion and empowering individuals of all abilities. It supports an inclusive culture by promoting respect and understanding for diverse needs, while training and awareness and initiatives like Purple Tuesday help educate staff on accessibility, best practices, and unconscious bias. We also know that robust support systems, whether that's assistive technology, flexible working arrangements, and accessible communication formats, really ensures that everyone can participate fully and equitably in the workplace. So accessibility is fundamental whenever you're looking at your people pillar. Moving into the place pillar, accessibility shapes both the physical and the digital environments, and again, to ensure equitable experiences for everyone. So when we look at the built environment, this does include things like ramps and lifts and accessible toilets, but tactile signage, accessible signage, and the inclusion of quiet spaces as well in the workplace. And that just enables the diverse physical and sensory needs of individuals to be met. And then when we look at the digital spaces, accessibility ensures that, you know, we're considering the websites, your apps, your internal systems that are designed so that they can be used by everyone. And then how we look at today, where we have a huge of organizations working in a hybrid way, you know, by thoughtfully designing and providing inclusive remote and in-person experiences, you are enabling your employees to engage fully, regardless of the location or their ability. And finally, when we look at the policy and process pillar, accessibility must be embedded within your organizational governance to ensure that there is long-term impact and that there is, importantly, accountability. So this includes compliance with legal standards such as the Equality Act or your Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, because these really do set the foundations for inclusive practices. We need to also look at your internal policies. These must reflect accessibility across your key processes like recruitment, your onboarding process, your own service delivery. If these are not accessible, then you will be preventing disabled talent from entering your workplace, but you're also then preventing the delivery of really accessible and inclusive experiences for your end user. And then what I think is vitally important in when we're looking at policy and process and governance is that there is a commitment to continuous improvement. We just don't stop. You know, your organization should regularly review and update your policies to align with the ever-evolving accessibility landscape, because standards are increasing, compliance and legislations are changing, and we just have to make sure that we are moving with those changes. And importantly, we're incorporating feedback from all of your disabled stakeholders to ensure that the lived experience is being considered when creating and curating any new service delivery or indeed policy or process. So now I'm going to ask Mike to come and share and get us started really with some top tips, because we feel that there is many things that you personally can do in your day-to-day that will make progress in terms of creating your own accessible workplace.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy to do that. I just want to go back, if I can, just on one point, because I want people to really understand, because the number that you gave about people who are disabled is an enormous number. And just to give us some examples about, it includes people like me, with a physical disability, and you've got blind people and deaf people. Mental health is a huge area, and I think one of the fastest growing disabilities, if you can phrase it like that, is people on the neurodiverse spectrum. One, because our knowledge of it is so much greater, and therefore people are getting diagnosed earlier, but also increasingly people are getting diagnosed in their 30s and 40s. But it's not just that. And I always give the example. I went about a year ago to a insurance company for non-executive directors. I get all the best gigs, and I was given the opportunity to talk about these issues, and it was a plenary. And at the end, this guy came over to me, and he said, "I just want to be honest with you. And you know what's going to happen when people say that." He said, if this hadn't been a plenary, I wouldn't have come. I would have gone to something else because I didn't actually think this topic was relevant. He said, but you have said that people who have rights under current legislation includes people who have cancer and who are fully recovered from cancer. And he said, I really listened because my wife has had cancer. She's luckily fully recovered, but she has multiple hospital appointments, and her employees really not understanding. And, she tries to accommodate them at lunchtime, but it probably takes her longer to get parked than her appointment. And it's become a real stress and anxiety for her. And he said, I'm going to tell her tonight, and then if it's okay, I'll ring you next week and tell you what's happened. And true to his word, he rang me the following week and said, just to let you know, she went into work the following day and reminded them that cancer and being fully recovered from cancer, you had rights under legislation, and they've given her the flexibility. So where she has to go for appointments, she makes the time up elsewhere in the week. And I say that because it's a workplace adjustment. And I say that because sometimes we have to think about the assumptions we make and rethink what some of our assumptions are. And many of you will probably have experience of colleagues who have long COVID. And I think the numbers are enormous, which again might require us to rethink our assumptions and rethink accessibility, but not necessarily lose the talent, but harness it in a different way in terms of workplace tips. And that probably gets us. I know we're going to do a double act, aren't we? one tip each. So my number one tip is ask, don't assume, and it relates to the last point. And I think as a disabled person, it's more respectful to ask me, someone who has lived the experience of disability, if they need help and how you could help them, rather than assuming I need it. And a really good example I use is I do a lot of traveling by myself across London. If you could see me, I'm 3'10" and I've got no arms and I'm lopsided. And about 8 months ago, I was getting out of a taxi in London and I saw a guy in the corner of my eye, and he raced across the road and he just took my briefcase and he said, "Look, I'm just going to help you across the road." And I said, "Oh, no, I'm absolutely fine, thank you." but he was insistent, and he was insistent to the point where it just had to happen. What he didn't know was, because I'm so lopsided, I carry my briefcase on my left shoulder with more rubbish in it than it probably needs to have, because it acts as a counterbalance. And so actually I felt more vulnerable with no briefcase being escorted across the road than I am on my own. And that's just a little example. But as I always say to people when I use that example, don't mix that up with acts of kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm asking everyone, provide acts of kindness, because the day we stop doing that or feel we can't do that anymore is the day we all have to pack up and go home. And I absolutely remember the day after that incident, I was back in London for an evening event, and I think I had a suit on and a tie on, and it was pouring down with rain. And anyone who knows Liverpool Street and where you wait for the taxis know there's absolutely no shelter at all. And this woman came over to me and said, I hope you don't mind, but I have an umbrella. Do you want to share it while we're standing in a taxi rank? And it was an absolute act of kindness that was actually saved me that evening, because I would have turned up at this event like a drowned rat otherwise. So ask, don't assume, but always remember acts of kindness are so important.
No, absolutely, definitely. And my top tip number 2 would be to follow the 6-second rule. And you may not know what this is, but this is the practice of pausing for at least 6 seconds after asking, especially important when you're interacting with somebody who is neurodivergent. This pause essentially allows the person the time to process information, to formulate a response, and ultimately to feel comfortable in engaging in the conversation without the pressure of interruption. And it's really simple, but it's really powerful way to promote respectful, inclusive communication. So my tip is to follow the 6-second rule. Mike?
No, absolutely. And we all know as humans, we don't like silence.
No, we don't.
And we try to fill the gaps. And in terms of the 6-second rule, actually, I was as guilty as anyone in not liking silence and then trying to start and finish the conversation for the other person.
Yeah.
And 99 times out of 100 got it wrong. And it is powerful. One thing I will say, and it makes me laugh, is that people go, Mike, we've tried this and it's absolutely brilliant, but the one thing we can tell you is the silence never 6 seconds. And I went, yes, it's probably more like 3.8 seconds, but the 3.8 seconds rule doesn't roll off the tongue as well as 6 seconds. So we're keeping it to 6 seconds. But the point is giving people that kind of space.
The space, yes.
That space, and it's really, really powerful. So the top tip 3, and I've kind of alluded to it in earlier, speak directly to the disabled person and not to their companion, their partner, their friends. And, it relates back to the shopping centre, that they either spoke to neither of us or only to my non-disabled partner. And just think about how you would feel, and how you would feel if you were in a work environment, and how you would feel if you were a customer as well. And so it's just really good practice to look people in the eye and talk to that person.
Absolutely. And so for top tip number 4, we want you to be prepared to slow down and repeat instructions when communicating. And this approach just ensures that individuals have, again, sufficient time to understand and to process the information being shared. And also, if the instructions are complex, by breaking them down into smaller, more manageable steps, you can really significantly improve, that clarity and reduce the overwhelm. So, making sure that you can be clear and concise, and doing it clearly and slowly, so that the recipient of that information is got the chance to have the ability to comprehend, to have the time to build that comprehension, and so that they can then be confident in terms of the delivery of those instructions, or indeed, again, the response that would follow. So be prepared to slow down and to repeat instructions clearly.
Yep. And top tip number 5, always announce yourself before touching or assisting a blind person. So, ask if they'd like you to take their arm and guide them, and use the elbow. Never grab their arm or their hand. And I think it's always important that a lot of disabled people, most disabled people, will be really appreciative of the support and help. But it's the context in which that is kind of said, and it is absolutely a straightforward way to do it. Just again, back to ask rather than assume.
Absolutely. So top tip number 6, it's really important you don't distract a guide or a service dog, because ultimately they're working and they need to stay focused to keep their handler safe. So if you're walking with someone who uses a guide dog, it's really important that you stay on the opposite side of the dog to avoid getting in its way. It's also important that you never pet or call the dog while it's working. And you can also really help by clearly describing the surroundings, including any obstacles, to support safe and confident navigation to the blind individual. So the key here is don't distract the guide dog or the service dog. They may be really, really cute, but this is not the time to be playing with them. This is a time to make sure that their handler is safe by not interrupting the dog while it's at work.
And top tip number 7 is, where possible, bring yourself to a person's eye level. So you won't particularly know, but actually I'm 3'10", so I have real experience of this, and the amount of times that kind of people lean over and bend to speak to me, and then they're halfway through a sentence and they go, "I'm really sorry, but my back really aches," or they get down on their knees and then can't get back up again. So my top tips of people who talk to me is grab a chair and sit on the chair, and we can have a conversation at eye level. But again, that applies to wheelchair users as well.
Yeah. Top tip number 8. It's really important to be aware that some people, especially those who are neurodivergent, they may be sensitive to things like bright lights, loud sounds, or strong smells. So you want to be mindful of the sensory sensitivities in shared spaces like the office, like a workplace. So even if these things don't affect you, it is thoughtful to check before bringing them into a shared space. So, for example, you might be better off dimming the lights, lowering the noise levels, avoiding bringing in scented products or smelly lunch into the office, because that can really make the environment uncomfortable for somebody. So just be mindful, do you want to play music in the office, or do you want to, have the lights on and full bright? It may not be suitable for everyone. So again, it comes back down to the ask if this is going to be okay for everyone involved in the office.
So top tip number 9 is make sure all of your communications are accessible. So be using as best practice clear, simple language, easily readable fonts, good color contrasts, and add alt text to images for screen readers. In meetings, offer live captioning, and if you're certainly using Teams or Zoom, it's there as a function. And I will give you a really top tip that most smartphones have an accessibility function, and your phone could be much more accessible than you probably ever think it could be. So some of it's already built in, and sign language if needed, and sharing of accessible files. You're not communicating effectively if a high percentage of people can't access that communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And our final top tip is based on the phrase, nothing about us without us. Hopefully most of you have come across this phrase before, but it's a really powerful principle that emphasizes the importance of including disabled people in the decisions that affect their lives. So that means actively involving them in conversations, planning, policy making, new product development, etc., especially when it comes to matters related to accessibility, inclusion, and disability. By hearing directly from your disabled stakeholders about their experiences, about what their needs and their wants are, to help drive the improvements or drive the changes within the organization or the way things are being done, these decisions are not made without them being consulted with as part of the development processes. So nothing about us without us is a really, really important principle to follow. So listen to their experiences, get their input, and ultimately genuinely value their contributions to those conversations as well. So I hope, and we hope, that you find these tips helpful. They're simple actions, like respectful conversations, like small changes to shared spaces, but these can really help you make accessibility part of your everyday, and ultimately make the experiences of disabled people around you a lot more inclusive and better ultimately in the end. So we hope that by putting these tips into practice, you help create better, more inclusive experiences for everyone every day. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. And I just want to say thank you for listening from me and from Mike. For more information on Purple Tuesday and how your organization can get involved, you can visit www.purpletuesday.co, or if you've got any questions for myself or Mike, you can email me on coverend@purpletuesday.co. Thank you for listening, and we will now have time for some questions.
Charlene and Mike, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I think that it's like I was really listening to the top tips that you were giving, and it's like in some ways it's like, I mean, none of it is rocket science, is it? And yet it's also it really challenges us in terms of how we're working, or how we are in the workplace. So yeah, thank you so much for that. We've got questions coming in. So yeah, the first one is actually about the tips. The tips were really helpful. Somebody said, when I offer to assist visually impaired people, I invite them to take my arm. Is that okay?
Yeah, and thank you, Kath. And I agree with you. And in some ways, top tips could be changed for the things that are common sense that you should do. And I think in some ways, the more simple they are, the better and more impactful the tip. So, in terms of the question, I think it's perfectly fine for the individual to ask the person with a sight impairment, would you like me to? And then respond accordingly. You know, sometimes it will be the other way around, and the person will say, will you? But either way is absolutely fine. It's got to be natural, it's got to be authentic. I think the point that we were making is you don't make assumptions and you just don't grab. And I think I always say, and I go back to the point because I think it's so important, apply the own common sense rule, and ask. It's all about context. Ask.
Yeah, and I guess it's like, this is another person in front of you, isn't it? That you're, because, if you kind of turn it round and you just think, well, would you want someone coming up and just grabbing you without the permission to do,
Absolutely.
to do
Absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Again, as Mike says, it's about common sense. How would you like to be treated? Yes. Would you like somebody just to come up and grab your arm? Then the answer would probably be no. So again, just have the respect to ask that of the visually impaired individual as well.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've got question 2 here, which is, how should we address things if we see that accessibility is not being met in places, even if they say that it is?
So sometimes this is down to the perception of what we mean is accessible. And there is an education that has to happen with across society, across cultures, across, what I mean. So it's about what is the understanding of what we mean is accessible. And so sometimes it's just about maybe highlighting the fact, in a respectful manner, by the way, that, oh, by the way, did you know that actually this is inaccessible to this type of individual or this disability or what have you? Because it could very well be that it's completely unintentional, that this inaccessible feature or practice is happening. And so sometimes take this as an opportunity to educate, but educate with kindness as well and understanding, because ultimately people are doing things in an unintentional way. They don't mean to be disrespectful, or they don't mean to cause a barrier, and so use it as an opportunity to educate is probably my advice on that.
And we've seen, and not so much now, but we used to see venues saying, oh, we have an accessible hearing loop, for example, and then someone asked to use it, and then none of the staff knew how to work the equipment, and then they realized it hadn't been reviewed for 3 or 4 years, so didn't work. And it's that kind of thing that is a barometer of, do we really care about accessibility? And it goes hand in hand with being honest as well. This is what we do have, and this is what we can provide, and this is what we can't provide, but here is a plan B for this situation. And I know it sounds daft, but being honest with disabled people around accessibility goes a long, long way.
Yeah. Yes. I was reminded when you were talking about that, I took my mother out to a cafe, and it was upstairs, and I just ran up and said, have you got any access? And they said, oh yes. They said it's not great. So they took us kind of round the corner and up in a lift and sort of through the kitchens, and then they had to put a ramp down over these stairs, and the ramp was so steep that I actually couldn't push her wheelchair up the ramp. I mean, she loved it because it was a bit of an adventure, but it wasn't quite what they were saying. But
Yeah, absolutely. We see and hear a lot of similar types of
It
situations.
resonates with
It
me.
resonates with
Yeah.
me. The number of trips that I've been with Mike, and we've ended up having to take a lovely detour just to get to the room where we're meant to be. One time we ended up in some weird escalator sort of ramp thing, and we saw the crowd where everybody else, we were at an event, and they all went left and we went right, and sort of, we didn't know where we were going. We were just like putting our complete trust on this person that was taking us to the room. But yes, it happens.
yes. So the next question is, how do you get around unconscious bias towards disabled people, especially in terms of the stigma surrounding disabled people not being as intelligent as non-disabled? Gosh, that's
a big question, yeah. And I think awareness and education comes back down to this. In order to be able to break down those viewpoints, you have to be able to demonstrate. It's through storytelling, case studies, actually showcasing that, and using the research that's out there and the statistics and so on to re-educate and reorientate people's opinions is essentially what is happening. Unconsciously, as I say, these biases are there. We've picked them all up along the way on our life and during our lifetimes and through our experiences and so on. And in order to break them down, you have to showcase and demonstrate that they are incorrect, and that the foundations of them are incorrect. And the only way that you can do that is by showing that is in action. So using examples of people with disabilities in leadership roles, showing people with disabilities who are innovative and creative and entrepreneurial and so on from that perspective, and looking at the research, the data is there. The data is there to show that is the case, and especially within the talent pool. We're missing out on a huge opportunity in engaging with disabled people more in the workplace and providing more opportunities because of these biases. And so we do have to break those down in order to see the true value that disabled people can bring to the workplace.
And it's events like this that raise awareness. And we have a process, which is you have to go through awareness, understanding, involvement and engagement. But you have to do that in our world, in our way, in a supportive way, because you don't know what you don't know. We all have assumptions, unconscious biases. That's just a reality. It's then what happens that really, really matters. And I always say that wheelchair users comprise 8% of the disabled population. So if lifts and ramps are a particular issue for your organisation, how are you supporting accessibility for the other 92% of disabled people? I am a 17%er. I was born with my disability. 83% will acquire. So what are you doing to make sure that people remain in the workplace once they acquire a disability? And actually the reality is up to 80% of disabled people have hidden impairments. So we have to reframe the assumptions that we make, and feel comfortable in doing that, in order then to apply, in order that question that has got asked around stigma gets gently dismantled.
Yeah. And it's about how the organization as well changes the culture so that disability is recognized and celebrated and not seen as a barrier and not seen as something that has to be fixed or accommodated. It's about, actually there is a real desire within that business to embrace and celebrate and recognize the value that disabled talent can bring. And that cultural change that has to be really authentic as well, will also enable that breakdown of those biases and those stereotypes and those stigmas as well.
Yeah, it was interesting, almost like the shift, so that as an organisation you really want to do it, rather than, oh gosh, this is the law, we've got to do it because of this, how can we find the money in the budget or whatever.
Absolutely.
We really want to, because we recognise the benefit of having having a diverse workforce.
Absolutely. And I've seen like a real shift in the last sort of 10 years, where it's becoming less about a tick box exercise. Am I compliant? Tick, yes. There is now this move towards, actually, no, there is a desire. There is actual real benefit, and organizations come to us and say, actually, we want a targeted campaign to attract the disabled talent into the business, because we see and we recognize the value that that's going to bring. How can we do that? How do we go about making sure, making our organization attractive to that disabled talent? So there's like, we have lots to do, absolutely, still, and there's more organizations to go on that journey as well, but we are starting to see that shift.
But there's a new dimension that's coming from the Gen Alpha kind of generation, who are growing up, and non-disabled and disabled, expecting a level of inclusion and diversity in the workplace and everywhere else. And actually, it is in their kind of set of values, and they're going to start making decisions about where they work and who they work for based on these values. So the pressures and the expectations about being accessible are also coming from your future labour workforce. And so the dynamic is changing from, look, we are where we are, we're trying our best, we have a level of intent, to, well, actually, we've got to do better than this. This is going to be expected. These are some of the non-negotiables. And if we don't, we're going to struggle to be competitive, because people won't want to come and work for us.
Yeah, interesting how things are changing. There's a couple more questions. So with invisible disabilities, what is a good response to give when you're accused of not being disabled, as it's not obvious? There's somebody saying that they get that a lot, and it's very confronting.
Well, yes, it is, and this is part of the challenge of somebody with a hidden impairment or a hidden disability, in that it can be tiresome and draining having to explain yourself all of the time. So yeah, no, I'm sorry that's how that individual is experiencing things. There is initiatives like the Hidden Disability Sunflower Lanyard that they can wear. That is a signal that says, I have a hidden impairment, a hidden disability, and therefore I may need additional support or accessibility requirements. So there is initiatives, if they don't want to verbalize, they can symbolize in that way. I also would be saying, again, it's about that education piece, because probably more likely, if they're being challenged, the individuals that are challenging them will have a very old set of ideas of what a disability is, in that, oh, you have to be a wheelchair user, or you have to be blind, etc., etc. So it's about that challenge, and maybe using it again with calm and kindness that says, well, did you know actually that nearly 80% of people that are living with a disability in the UK have a hidden impairment? Were you aware of that? And if they're happy to say, and I'm actually one of them, and maybe if they feel confident to be able to say, and this is what I've got, I am neurodivergent, or I'm autistic, or whatever it is the impairment is, just to educate, because sometimes then that will change that individual's perception, and then they'll never challenge again another person. So it's sort of like going through that pain to understand that the next time they've influenced the change in that individual's behavior, that ultimately then passes on over time. And unfortunately, until we get it to a level of understanding and education of what we mean by disability today, that there is the risk of these biases and these stereotypes. They're still in existence. So that's my advice. Symbolize, use things like the sunflower lanyard scheme as a way of showing that you have a hidden disability without having to say it. And indeed, if somebody does challenge, use it as an opportunity to educate.
And in terms of the workplace, it's a leadership issue as well. So I would spin the question around and say, as a workplace and as a leadership team, why do we have people who clearly are in the organisation with hidden impairments, because the numbers will tell you that, who are choosing not to disclose? And then you have to ask yourself a whole series of really quite difficult questions, and it may be you have to take 2 steps back and go, look, we're not going to have an open door policy because people aren't clearly going to come and say the reason I'm not disclosing is because. So it may be that the organisation, the workplace, the team take a step back and go, look, we want to find out why and what's going on in our organisation, because otherwise we won't be able to fix it. I've seen really good examples of where organisations have done anonymous kind of feedback that doesn't pinpoint individuals but gets a sense of those cultural, those physical, those other issues that are preventing people from wanting to disclose. And I think it's really interesting in organizations, and normally that has to be top down, by the way, because people need to trust that they can share their information and they're not going to be disadvantaged from doing that. So I would say generally it's a top down an initiative, but I can absolutely tell you where there's a genuine understanding that the workplace is intentionally trying to move this agenda forward, suddenly your disclosure rates will go up significantly and quickly.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? And that's where potentially people may fear the prejudice or that they're going to think, oh, somebody's just getting on the bandwagon, because I think sometimes people hear that or experience that in the workplace as well, or they're just saying they're this or whatever. So, but like you say, if it's a top-down approach. Okay.
That's consistent. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've got quite a long question here, which I think the whole of it is not going to show on across the screen, but I'll read it all of it out. So, any advice on lighting and distractions in an open plan call centre or office environment? Sometimes it's not easy to dim lights in certain areas. Would it be better to allocate a specific area for someone to work who needs this reasonable adjustment, which could be made more comfortable for them?
So one, I would liaise and discuss with the individual that this is impacting, because they themselves will have a better sense of what's going to work for them. I would be wary of just allocating them a place, especially if it's an open plan and then you've decided to put them in a room separate to everyone, away from everything, and it may be not what they want, because they still may want to be social in that respect. So again, it's about meeting the needs of the individual, and again, not making that assumption of, yes, I know what adjustment that you need therefore. There's lots of lovely, there's great things out there that can support. Like I'm not probably the most technical person to be able to advise on that, but there are, seek advice from inclusive design experts who will be able to give you guidance in terms of your office layout and space. It could be that there's an area within the open plan that's a little bit less, noisy and stimulating in comparison to other areas. So if you haven't done a accessibility review of your office space, this could be an opportunity to do that and use this as an opportunity to actually make the whole space more inclusive and accessible rather than just one little corner. So that would be my thoughts there. Having a breakout area is quite nice in that if it is overstimulating, that there is that opportunity for that individual to remove themselves and maybe take themselves to another space for a reset from the situation. But one consults with the individual that this is actually impacting, to be able to come up with a solution and adjustment together, and consider having an inclusive design review of your office space in order to make sure that you're actually making the whole environment as accessible and inclusive as possible. So yes, that's my advice there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I've got a couple of questions here that are actually, I think I'm going to ask them together because they're quite linked, and I think they're probably linked into the sunflower lanyard you were talking about before. So this is, do you think having a type of universal indicator like lanyards people could wear to show what people are comfortable with or capable of to help stop assumptions from others? And then the second question is, are there ways to clearly indicate that there's a hidden disability to consider without having to declare or explain, like a badge? So that sounds like something a bit more about the sunflower.
Yes. So the sunflower lanyard scheme it's getting pretty well internationally recognized as a symbol of hidden disability. So I would probably avoid trying to implement another version of the same thing. And that sort of leads into the other question of, do we create a badge that illustrates what I can do? Because again, it's very individualistic around that. There is some amazing tech, by the way. We had a summit ourselves a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, where we focused in on accessible, inclusive technology. And there's amazing things at the minute where, especially if you're like going to a venue or a destination, that you can have the information with your access requirements or your needs, and you can get it sent to the space beforehand so they understand what to do whenever they're welcoming you or meeting your needs there. Or indeed, you can have it's nearly like a QR code where they can scan and all of it, then your needs are presented to that customer service desk. So there is things that are being created all the time in order to be able to prevent the individual having to constantly go over and say the same things time and time again, to be able to remove that barrier. But in terms of like a symbol, to be able to immediately identify in terms of a hidden disability at the minute is the sunflower. So I would absolutely go to that. And in different countries, by the way, they have different types of disability cards as well. ID cards that you can show that obviously shows that you have a disability, and not necessarily like, oh, I need a wheelchair, I'm a wheelchair user, but it's a wider disability cards as well.
And I know historically across government there was a thing called the accessibility passport that kind of documented the reasonable adjustments that were needed, was owned by the individual staff member, updated by the individual staff member, and would be shared with the relevant line managers, etc., on a need-to-know basis. So there was a level of transparency, but not a kind of free-for-all in terms of everyone having to know. And that was really a powerful way, particularly when people were moving across teams in one particular department. So there was a level of continuity, and in the nicest sense, because what I think was happening years ago was, if you were a disabled employee and you had a good line manager, you never wanted to be promoted because you would actually maybe potentially lose that line manager. But also the accessible passport worked across departments as well in order to support career development. And sometimes it's those things that just need a bit of modernizing, need to be digitized, but actually fundamentally it's about sharing of information with the person at the center of the process. And I think that's incredibly important, because in a workplace, actually, ultimately, you need that person to have the reasonable adjustments in place in order they're productive, they're happy, because it then works for the organization as well.
Yeah, and we know that the civil service adjustment passport is still in place.
Yes.
Now, if you've got time, we've got just one more question. Are you okay to go with that one as
Yes.
well, Charlene? Because we're just running over a little bit. So giving customers anonymous feedback questionnaires would be really helpful. Do you have a feedback form that can be used?
Yeah, so I think this relates to the point I made earlier, in this world of digital, actually it's slightly more difficult to make it anonymous. So what I say to organizations is you may have to go back 20 years and think about, you know, on election day when you go into a booth or go in somewhere and you have to actually write something on a bit of paper, and then you put it in a box. It might be as simple as that. And my view on the feedback is don't overcomplicate it. Don't create templates. Don't, you know, allow free flow. And if people are wanting to provide you with anonymous feedback, it's because they got something really important to say. So let them say it, and then, you know, you will quickly pick out the themes and the issues. And my advice would be, you know, be clear about the purpose, give reassurances about the level of anonymity, and be really clear that you're going to be transparent with the organization after the process about what the process has said. And that does not mean that everything that got put in that box then has to be implemented, for all sorts of reasons. But it also says, look, here are the issues that came up. Here are the fixes that we can do and we're going to do. Here are the things we need to take away and think about. And here are the things that have come up but we've chosen not to do because it will impact unintentionally on this group of people for these reasons. So surveys and feedback is all about communication. It's all about building relationship between your staff and your senior managers, and just making a better connection with individuals who are disabled and non-disabled, by the way, who almost certainly will have lived experience outside of work as well, because the nature of 24% of disabled people in the population will mean that there will be an experience. And actually tapping into that experience and showing to all your workforce that this accessibility matters is an important way of giving a nod of intent. And you'll find you do all those things, and the acceleration of what needs to happen on the ground in the workplace will become much quicker and quicker and quicker.
And from a practicality point of view, is having multiple ways for people to provide feedback, because we just don't all communicate in the one way. So having a digital format, a written format, interview format, what have you, just have multiple different channels. And with regards to having a standard customer feedback form, I would absolutely tailor it to your organization and the service or the product or whatever it is that you're doing, in order to make sure that you're getting the data that is going to actually enable you to drive changes and improvements to those experiences. So those are the types of things that we can help and support, making sure that the questions and that you're asking are inclusive and accessible, and then looking at making sure that the methodology that you're using to gather that feedback is accessible and inclusive as well.
Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you, Charlene and Mike. What a great session. I know there's been some really lots and lots of chat in the chat. Just to share one comment with you before we finish, that's come from somebody in the audience. Thank you, Mike and Charlene, for a great session. The work you're doing is so important, educating people and making society a better place.